It started with red shoes in the snow. A little girl, no more than 8, standing barefoot beside 2 old people shivering on the highway. Her grandfather's lips were purple. Her grandmother could barely breathe. They had been thrown out by their own son. And when the storm swallowed them whole, no one stopped until a man in an old truck slammed on his brakes. "Get in the car," he said. "No one survives alone." That man was a former Navy SEAL who had already buried his family once. He didn't know that the people he saved would lead him back to the one truth he'd been running from, and to a debt written 15 years earlier in another storm, on another mountain. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching this from tonight? And how does this story make you feel? Please subscribe, because I truly want to know how far a story of mercy can travel across this earth. The night had no color, only white, endless and consuming. Winds swept across the Montana plains like the breath of something ancient, carving ridges into the snow, whistling through the broken fences that lined the road. The sky was a smear of iron and smoke, its horizon erased, the world reduced to sound and cold and instinct. In the middle of that storm, a single pair of headlights cut a trembling path through the dark. Inside the truck, the air smelled of wet leather and iron dust. Ethan Hawkwood, 45, sat forward, both hands gripping the steering wheel as if holding on to reason itself. His shoulders were broad but slightly slumped from years of carrying invisible weight. The dashboard light flickered across a jaw shadowed by stubble, across a pair of gray-blue eyes that had seen too much war to still believe in peace. Beside him, Hunter, a 6-year-old German shepherd, large and alert, breathed slow but steady. The dog's coat shimmered with the faint sheen of frost, and his ears twitched with every groan of the wind. Outside, the storm clawed harder like a living thing. Snow swirled in circles, rising and falling, erasing the road beneath the truck's tires. Ethan leaned closer to the windshield, squinting into the blur. Every instinct told him to pull over, to wait it out. But he kept driving. For men like him, stopping was often the same as surrender. The tires hummed low over the frozen asphalt, and for a moment the world was only rhythm, the hiss of snow, the soft exhale of Hunter beside him, the pulse of the dashboard clock. But then the rhythm broke. A shadow crossed the beam of the headlights, small at first, then multiplying. Human shapes swaying in the whiteout. Ethan's foot hit the brake. The truck spun slightly, the back end skidding out before finding grip again. The figures resolved through the blur, 3 of them. The first, an old man, tall but bent, his shoulders shaking beneath a wool coat too thin for the cold. The second, a woman wrapped in a patterned shawl, her lips blue, her hands clutching at the man's sleeve as they stumbled forward. And between them, barely visible beneath the swirl of snow, was a little girl. Her red dress whipped in the wind, the fabric stiff with ice, her bare legs scratched by frost. She clung to a small stuffed bear, its fur matted with snow, its button eye missing. Ethan's heart jolted, a single hard thud. He opened the door. The wind rushed in like an ocean breaking free. Hunter barked once, sharp, warning. But Ethan was already stepping into the storm. The cold hit him like a blade. His breath turned to mist before his face, the snow biting his skin. He moved fast, boots crunching through drifts, eyes fixed on the 3 shapes ahead. The old man turned first, his arm instinctively drawing the girl behind him. Even through the frost, Ethan saw the defiance in the man's stance, frail but unbroken, a dignity carved by decades. The woman's gaze was different, wide, frightened, desperate, yet calm, the kind of calm that comes when fear has already taken everything. Ethan lifted both hands, palms open, a gesture of peace against the violence of the storm. No words, not yet. The wind was too loud, and sometimes silence was the only way to earn trust. Then the old man spoke, his voice trembling but clear enough to cut through the wind. "She's freezing," he said, nodding toward the girl. "But there's nowhere left to go." The woman's shawl slipped, revealing fingers raw and cracked from cold. The child's teeth chattered, her breath shallow, but her eyes, dark, still determined, never left Ethan's face. She was afraid, but she didn't cry. Ethan took one step closer, then another, moving slow enough to let them choose. He pointed back toward his truck. "There's heat," he said, barely above the howl of the wind. "Please." The man hesitated. In his eyes flickered something heavier than fear, pride, guilt, the kind of pain that keeps a man standing even when he's already fallen. He shook his head once, muttering words that the storm nearly stole away. "My son said we don't belong anymore. Not in that house. Not in this world." Ethan stopped. That kind of pain he knew too well. He'd heard it in hospital wards, in battlefield whispers, in the quiet of his own mirror. The snow pressed harder against them, whipping sideways, cruel and relentless. The girl swayed, her knees buckling. Ethan didn't think, he moved. In 3 strides he reached her, kneeling so his eyes met hers. The bear fell from her hand, landing soundlessly in the snow. Her breath was shallow, her cheeks flushed red with the burn of cold. Ethan reached out, gloved hand extended. For a heartbeat she didn't move. Then, without looking at her grandparents, she placed her tiny fingers into his palm. They were like ice. He lifted her gently, holding her close against his chest. The old man didn't protest this time. The fight in him melted into exhaustion. Together they trudged toward the truck, Hunter circling back, pressing against the girl's dangling leg as if guiding her home. Inside, the cab filled quickly with breath and heat, the windows fogged. The woman held the girl close, rubbing her hands against her small body, whispering prayers that sounded more like apologies. The old man stared out at the storm, his face a map of disbelief and surrender. Ethan drove without speaking. The sound of the heater filled the silence. Hunter lay in the back seat, head resting near the child's feet, eyes half closed but alert. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the presence of others in his truck, a strange weight, almost sacred. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The girl's eyes were half open now, her lashes wet with melting snow. The reflection of red from her dress glowed faintly in the dim light, like a small ember refusing to die. Outside, the storm howled on, but inside, the warmth began to return. The woman exhaled a broken sigh. The man clasped his trembling hands together and whispered, "You stopped. No one ever stops." Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. Words had always felt too small for moments like this. Instead, he focused on the road, his mind a blur of memory, of comrades left behind, of strangers he hadn't saved, of nights not so different from this one. The child stirred. "Mister?" she murmured softly, her voice a thread. "Are we safe now?" He looked at her in the mirror again, and though his lips didn't move, something in his eyes said yes. The truck climbed the narrow pass, tires crunching through snowbanks. The headlights struck a line of fence posts bending under ice, their wire humming low, the sound almost human. Above them, the moon broke through clouds for an instant, a pale coin of mercy. When they reached the ridge, Ethan slowed. Below lay a scattering of lights. His cabin, miles from town, its roof half buried but its chimney still standing. He stopped the truck, letting the engine idle. For a moment, no one spoke. The old man turned toward him, mouth opening as if to thank, then closing again. Words seemed too fragile. The woman held the girl close, her lips moving soundlessly. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft now, quieter. Hunter whined once, pressing his nose against the window. Ethan exhaled and opened the door. The air outside felt less cruel now, though the cold still bit through his coat. He stepped out, looking back toward the road that had brought them here, empty again, wiped clean by wind. Sometimes the world erases pain quickly, he thought. Too quickly. The old man's voice broke the silence, barely audible from inside the truck. You shouldn't have stopped for us. Ethan turned his head, the faintest smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. Maybe not, he said quietly. But I did. He reached out, closing the door gently. The engine hummed low, steady, a heartbeat against the night, somewhere between the cold and the heat, between guilt and grace. Something fragile and human took root. It wasn't salvation, not yet, but it was the beginning of something close. And as the truck rolled forward again, disappearing into the white, the road behind them vanished, covered by new snow as if mercy itself had chosen to leave no trace. The wind had not stopped all night. It pressed against the cabin walls like a living creature, testing the wood for weakness, slipping through cracks in thin, icy breaths. The sound was not a roar anymore, but a pulse, a heartbeat of winter that seemed to echo through every board and nail. Outside, the hills had disappeared beneath a white ocean. Inside, the air smelled of smoke, damp wool, and something faintly metallic, the scent of exhaustion. Ethan moved slowly through the narrow space, his boots leaving wet marks on the wooden floor. The fire hissed in the stone hearth, light flickering over the faces of the three he had brought in from the snow. Jonas Hale, the old man, sat closest to the flames, his face hollow, skin drawn tight around high cheekbones. Martha, his wife, was beside him, wrapped in a quilt too big for her small frame, her gray hair escaping its braid in soft wisps. Between them, half hidden in the folds of a blanket, sat Lily, their granddaughter, quiet and still, her brown hair clinging to her cheeks as she traced fog circles onto the window pane with one finger. Ethan said nothing. He didn't need to. The way Jonas's shoulders slumped told more than words could. The way Martha's hands trembled as she lifted a cup said the rest. Silence here was not emptiness. It was full of memories of shame, of things they weren't ready to speak. Hunter lay by the door, his body a wall of warmth and quiet watchfulness. Every few minutes his ears twitched, catching some distant sound that the others could not. His dark fur glowed faintly in the firelight, and his chest rose and fell in a rhythm that steadied the room. Outside, the storm beat on, relentless. Ethan set a pot on the small iron stove, poured in what little broth he had, and stirred. The movement was slow, mechanical. The spoon clicked against the pot like a ticking clock. He didn't look at them as he worked. His eyes were elsewhere, perhaps on other nights, other storms. Faces long gone but never forgotten. He didn't ask where they came from. He didn't ask who had driven them out. Some truths carried their own scent. You could feel them before they were spoken. The soup simmered, thin but hot. When Ethan placed the bowls in front of them, no one reached for theirs immediately. They just stared, as if unsure the food was real, or as if taking it meant admitting how hungry they truly were. It was Martha who moved first, her cracked lips parting to murmur a quiet "thank you" that no one answered. Jonas ate slowly, each spoonful trembling in his hand. Every cough that followed was low, strained, and wet. When he thought Ethan wasn't looking, he pressed a handkerchief to his lips. The red that bloomed there was faint but unmistakable. He folded the cloth carefully, hiding it in his sleeve. Some men hide their pride, others hide their dying. Martha's wrists, as she reached for her cup, bore faint bruises, fading but not forgotten by the skin. Ethan noticed, though he pretended not to. He only looked toward the fire, jaw tightening. Hunter shifted his weight, as if sensing the quiet tension in his master's thoughts. The dog's tail brushed lightly against Lily's foot, drawing from her the smallest smile. Quick, fragile, gone almost as soon as it came. Lily hadn't spoken a word since they entered. She sat near the hearth, her knees pulled up to her chest, eyes fixed on the glass window. The warmth had brought color back to her face, but her silence hung heavy like a thread stretched thin. Ethan caught himself watching her reflection, a small, motionless figure framed by the storm outside. He wondered what a child could have seen to learn that kind of stillness. Hours passed. The fire burned lower. The rhythm of the storm began to change, not softer, just slower, as though the night itself was tired. Jonas dozed in the chair, his breath shallow, Martha's hand resting on his arm. Ethan sat by the table, oil lamp casting a pool of yellow light over a half-cleaned rifle. It wasn't paranoia that made him check it. It was habit, survival written into muscle memory. Hunter suddenly lifted his head, his ears pricked, his throat humming a low, rolling growl that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the restless sound of a dog dreaming. It was warning, ancient, instinctive, certain. Ethan froze. The spoon slipped from his hand and clattered against the bowl. The noise startled Martha awake. "What is it?" she whispered, but Ethan was already moving. He crossed to the window in 3 long strides, wiping away the fog with the sleeve of his jacket. At first he saw only white. The night was a blur of snow and shadow. Then something broke the surface. Faint, deliberate, wrong. Tracks, fresh tire tracks cutting across the drifts, too close to the tree line to be wind-carved. The pattern was clean, the tread deep. He followed the line with his eyes until it disappeared behind the pines where something darker waited. The faint shape of a vehicle, low and broad, its black paint catching a dull reflection of light from the cabin's fire. A truck. No, an SUV. Parked, engine off, watching. The cold pressed harder against the window pane, as if the night itself had drawn closer to listen. Hunter growled again, deeper now, the sound rising from his chest like thunder under ice. Ethan's hand went instinctively to the pistol on the shelf, not raising it yet, only feeling its weight, the way a man tests the edge of an old memory. Jonas stirred in his chair, confusion clouding his eyes. "Is someone out there?" His voice was weaker than before. Ethan didn't answer. The question didn't need one. He moved to the lamp, dimmed it until only the firelight remained. The room sank into a soft orange darkness, the kind that makes every sound louder, every breath a confession. Through the frosted glass, Ethan could still make out the faint silhouette of the SUV. No headlights, no movement. Whoever was inside knew how to wait. Martha held Lily tighter, whispering something into the child's ear. Maybe a prayer, maybe a story meant to drown out fear. The girl looked up at Ethan, her eyes wide, unblinking. There was no fear in them this time, only awareness, as if she understood before anyone else that the world outside had not let them go. The fire snapped sharply, sparks lifting for a moment before dying mid-air. The walls creaked again, long and low, like the house itself was exhaling. Ethan stood near the window for what felt like an hour, watching, waiting for a movement that didn't come. The storm's howl grew again, a long, mournful cry sweeping down the valley. But beneath it, hidden deep in the white noise, another sound lingered. A hum of an engine turning once, then silencing. Not gone, just closer. Ethan whispered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. "We're not alone tonight." Hunter pressed against his leg, a silent promise in the dark. And in that small cabin buried beneath the hills, warmth and fear burned side by side, one feeding the other, as the wind outside carried a message meant only for those who still believe danger ends when the door is shut. Morning didn't arrive. It limped in, bruised and colorless. The storm had passed, but what it left behind wasn't peace, only silence thick enough to hear your own heart beating. Light seeped through the frost-bitten window, pale and hesitant, stretching over the floorboards like something unsure of its welcome. The air was sharp with the smell of cold ash and iron, the last traces of smoke rising from the hearth where Jonas knelt, feeding the fire with trembling hands. He moved slowly, each motion deliberate, as though the weight of memory had turned his bones to glass. Ethan watched from across the room, elbows resting on his knees, the lines around his mouth deepened by fatigue. The firelight made ghosts of them all. Shapes caught between life and the fading warmth of yesterday. Martha sat beside Jonas, mending a tear in the quilt with thread she could barely see. Her fingers shook, but not from the cold. There was a different kind of tremor there, one that came from remembering too much for too long. Jonas broke the silence first, his voice rough, brittle as dried pine snapping underfoot. "He threw us out," he said, eyes fixed on the flame. "After the will, after the shouting." His words didn't hang in the air. They sank, heavy as stones dropped into water. Ethan didn't move. He only listened, the way soldiers listen to the last breath of someone they couldn't save. Jonas spoke in fragments, the story spilling out like splinters. How their only son had accused them of cheating him. How he'd demanded the deed to the land. How words once meant for love had turned to weapons. "He called us dead weight," Jonas said, voice cracking. "Said the house was his now. We left before he could prove it." Martha turned her face away. The firelight caught the corner of her eye, and for a moment it seemed as though it flickered from within. She pulled the quilt tighter, a small act of pride against the shame that filled the room. Ethan didn't speak right away. The quiet stretched between them like a wound that refused to close. He knew what it was to be cut from your own blood, to be forgotten by those who shared your name. The world had many ways of teaching a man that love, once broken, can turn colder than snow. Hunter lay near the door, chin resting on his paws, his eyes following each sound with quiet alertness. The storm had stopped, but the air still carried a hum. Something distant, something waiting. The dog lifted his head once, ears twitching toward the window, then lowered it again, as if even he knew that peace never lasted long. Lily sat cross-legged by the hearth, her red dress now dry but still wrinkled from the night before. The soft glow of the fire painted her face in shades of amber and rose. She traced patterns on the floor with a small twig, silent as always. Then, without warning, she spoke. Her voice was light, too soft for a room so full of sorrow. "Daddy said we're better off, gone." No one breathed for a moment. The words, so small and innocent, struck harder than any accusation. Ethan looked up, his jaw tightening. Martha's needle froze mid-stitch. Jonas turned, and the firelight showed the hollowness behind his eyes, the space where forgiveness should have been but wasn't. Hunter shifted closer to the girl, pressing his head gently against her knee. It was a wordless comfort, something pure and instinctive that no human had been able to offer. Lily smiled faintly, her fingers curling into the dog's fur. Ethan's gaze lingered on them. The child and the animal. Two quiet souls who seemed to understand more than most grown men ever would. His throat tightened. He turned away before anyone could see the wetness gathering in his eyes. It wasn't just their pain that moved him. It was the echo of his own. He had carried his brother's death like a scar for years. A brother lost not to war, but to greed, when inheritance and pride had torn their family apart. Some wounds never stopped bleeding. They just learned to hide beneath the skin. The wind outside shifted, whispering against the windows like a memory trying to find its way back in. The fire cracked, and a shower of sparks rose, then fell. Jonas's breathing had grown rougher, a rasp caught in his chest. Ethan stood and added another log to the flames, though he knew the cold wasn't just in the air. It was in their bones. For a time, the only sound was the creak of wood and the soft hum of the storm retreating. The world outside was calm, deceptively calm, as if drawing a deep breath before the next blow. Then, a sound, a dull, heavy thud. Ethan froze. Hunter's ears shot up, body tense, muscles rippling beneath his coat. Another thud followed, louder this time, sharper, the unmistakable rhythm of knuckles against wood. A knock, hard and deliberate. Jonas looked toward the door, confusion clouding his face. Martha clutched the quilt. Lily's small hand went still in Hunter's fur. The knock came again. 3 times, each hit like a heartbeat made of steel. Then a voice, muffled by the door but strong enough to fill the room. "Open up, old man. We're taking what's ours." The words slashed through the air. Ethan's pulse quickened, though his face remained still. Hunter rose, teeth bared just enough for the light to catch them, a low growl curling through his chest. Jonas tried to stand, gripping the arm of his chair, but Ethan reached out and stopped him with a subtle shake of the head. No need for words. There were some fights old men shouldn't have to face again. Outside, the wind howled, dragging snow against the windows like fingernails. The firelight trembled, shadows lengthening across the cabin walls. Another knock. Harder. This one rattled the hinges. Ethan stepped toward the door, each movement measured, his boots making soft, heavy sounds against the floor. Hunter moved with him, head low, body poised. Through the frost of the window pane, Ethan caught the faint outline of 2 figures standing in the snow. Their shapes blurred by the cold, but their intent was sharp as glass. He could feel Martha's eyes on him, hear Lily's breathing quicken. The smell of smoke and fear mingled until he couldn't tell one from the other. Outside, the voice came again, louder, closer. "You hear me, old man? We know you're in there." Ethan rested a hand on the doorframe, fingers brushing against the worn wood. For a moment, time held its breath. The world was reduced to the space between his heartbeat and the next knock. And then it came. A final booming strike that made the cabin tremble. Hunter growled low, his gaze locked on the door, ready. The sound echoed into the mountains, swallowed by the snow. Inside, Ethan's eyes hardened, the firelight flickering across the reflection of something colder than the storm itself. The peace of the night was gone, and somewhere beyond that wooden door the past had come knocking. The door didn't knock this time. It exploded, wood cracked, snow burst in, and for a heartbeat the firelight was swallowed whole by the storm. Ethan rose instinctively, hand reaching for balance, eyes narrowing through the sudden white chaos. Hunter was already on his feet, a low growl rippling through the cabin like distant thunder. 2 silhouettes filled the doorway, dark, swaying, blurred by the cold. When the light caught them, their faces emerged from the storm's throat. Caleb Hale, in his late 30s, broad-shouldered, jaw tight but unshaven, reeked of whiskey and winter. His eyes, once blue, were red now, fevered, the kind of eyes that mistake pride for courage. Behind him was Diane, his wife, mid-30s, thin, her mascara streaked, her coat undone, hair tangled like the storm itself. She clutched her arms around her, not out of cold, but as if trying to hold herself together before the guilt broke her apart. Caleb's voice cut through the crackling wood like a rifle shot. "You think you can hide them from me, old man?" Jonas struggled to stand, his hand gripping the chair, the years of fatherhood and regret pulling against his bones. Martha gasped softly, her trembling fingers tightening on the quilt. Ethan stepped forward, quiet as a tide rising, his shadow merging with the fire's flicker. "Not tonight," he said, no louder than necessary, but it carried the weight of a man who had seen too much to be threatened by one more storm. The words halted Caleb for half a breath. He squinted, recognizing in Ethan not fear, but something far more dangerous. Composure. The kind that belongs to soldiers and ghosts. "Who the hell are you?" Caleb spat, his voice jagged with alcohol. "Some washed-up soldier?" Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. His stillness was its own reply, and the kind of silence that makes men remember every wrong they've ever done. Diane's gaze darted between them. Her lips trembled, but not from cold. "Caleb, please," she whispered. "Not in front of them." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment the anger on her face dissolved into something older. Shame. But Caleb was too far gone to hear it. He took a step forward, his boots leaving wet scars across the floor. "You don't belong here," he said, pointing at Jonas, the hand shaking. "You left me nothing. You hear me?" "Nothing!" Martha began to cry quietly, her sobs muffled in the quilt. Ethan's jaw tightened. He could feel Hunter beside him, muscles coiled, waiting for a signal that never came. There was enough violence in the world already. He wouldn't add more to it. Caleb's rage burned hot, but it wasn't real strength. It was the kind of fury that hides a wound too deep to name. He lunged forward, reaching for his father's arm. And that's when Ethan moved. It wasn't a fight. It was precision. One step, one turn, one movement too fast for Caleb's drunken reflexes to follow. Ethan caught his wrist, twisted gently, firmly until the tension broke and the knife, small, hidden in his sleeve, clattered to the floor. The sound of metal on wood echoed longer than it should have. "Sit down," Ethan said softly, still holding Caleb's gaze. "You've done enough." Caleb's breath came heavy, his pride cracking open beneath the weight of calm authority. He didn't sit, but he stopped moving. Diane burst into tears. "Stop it! Just stop!" she cried, the words torn between fear and remorse. "They didn't take anything from you. You took it from yourself." Her voice echoed through the cabin, and for the first time since the door had burst open, silence fell. It wasn't peace, just absence. The kind that follows the breaking of something fragile. Then from the corner of the room a small voice spoke. Lily had stood up. She was trembling, but her eyes were steady, glowing amber in the firelight. "Stop yelling," she said softly. "Grandma's heart hurts when you do." It wasn't loud, it wasn't brave, but it was the only truth that could reach them. The kind that doesn't shout, just stands there, small and pure, daring the world to listen. Diane covered her mouth. Martha froze mid-sob. Jonas closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down the lines of his weathered face. Even Hunter's growl died away, replaced by the slow, rhythmic sound of his breathing. Caleb stared at the girl. The alcohol haze cracked. Beneath it was something fragile, something like shame. His shoulders fell and his breath hitched in a sound too quiet to be a sob. For a moment he looked not like a man, but like a boy who had lost his way too long ago. Ethan released his grip and stepped back, giving him space. The knife remained on the floor, gleaming faintly in the light, a relic of the rage that had just burned out. "Go home," Ethan said finally, voice low, not cruel. "Before the storm turns back." Caleb looked at him, but the fight was gone. He turned to Jonas, his mouth moving as if to speak, but no words came. Diane took his arm gently, guiding him toward the door. Her eyes met Ethan's, a quiet plea for understanding. He gave a single nod. No forgiveness yet, but something close enough to carry. When they stepped out, the cold rushed in again, filling the cabin with the scent of snow and regret. The door closed slowly behind them, its latch catching with a hollow click. For a long while, no one moved. The fire popped softly, shedding sparks that floated, then vanished. Martha reached for Jonas's hand. Lily sat down beside Hunter, resting her head against his neck. Ethan remained standing, staring at the door, his expression unreadable. He could have stopped them permanently. He could have made the hurt even, the score settled. But mercy, he knew, was the harder weapon to wield. It demanded strength without violence, faith without reward. The wind outside softened, carrying away the sound of retreating footsteps. In its place came a stillness so profound it felt sacred. Ethan turned back toward the fire, his shadow stretching long across the floor. The cabin, bruised but standing, seemed to exhale at last, and somewhere deep in the walls, between the creaks of old wood and the sigh of cooling embers, the storm inside them began to fade. The night dissolved slowly into gray. Snow still drifted, but softer now, a tired sigh rather than a howl. Inside the cabin, the fire had dwindled to embers. Ethan sat near it, elbows on his knees, listening to the soft crackle, the breath of those sleeping behind him, and the distant sound of an engine crawling up the frozen road. Hunter lifted his head first. His ears twitched, and a low rumble formed in his throat. Not fear, just alertness. Then came the crunch of tires over ice, deliberate and heavy. The kind of sound that carried authority. Moments later, the faint flash of red and blue filtered through the thin curtains. The sheriff had arrived. The door opened with a hesitant knock before Ethan could stand. A man stepped in, brushing snow off his uniform jacket. Sheriff Wade Ellison, mid-50s, tall, with gray hair and the kind of calm that comes from decades of seeing everything and still believing in order. His eyes moved slowly across the room. The rifle on the wall, the broken latch on the door, the trembling elderly couple wrapped in quilts, and Ethan standing motionless in the glow of the hearth. "Morning," the sheriff said, voice low even. "Neighbor called in, said they heard gunshots up this way." "No shots," Ethan replied. "Only noise," the sheriff nodded once. "Mind if I take a look around?" Ethan stepped aside without a word. The man's boots creaked across the boards as he circled the room, his gaze noting details with the quiet precision of habit. The overturned chair, the melted snow near the door, the small knife still resting on the floorboards from the night before. "Looks like something happened," the sheriff murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Jonas cleared his throat. His voice was thin but steady. "My son came here last night. He wanted—" "What isn't his?" The sheriff stopped writing. "Is he coming back?" Jonas shook his head, slow. "No. The storm took what it needed from him." Martha's eyes glistened as she looked at her husband. Ethan said nothing, only crossed to the stove, poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to the sheriff. The man accepted it with a nod. "All right," the sheriff said, pulling a small notepad from his coat pocket. "Start from the beginning." And so Ethan told him. Not the whole story, just enough of it to make sense. The arrival, the shouting, the knife, the silence that followed. Jonas confirmed every word with quiet nods, his hand never leaving Martha's. The sheriff scribbled in slow, deliberate strokes, his face unreadable. When it was done, he sighed and looked around the cabin again. "You know," he said gently, "you could have called for help." Ethan glanced toward the radio on the shelf, broken, its cord frayed, dusted with ash. "Didn't have the signal," he said simply. The sheriff smiled faintly, as if understanding more than he let on. He turned toward the mantel where a single photograph sat in a wooden frame, half covered by dust and shadow. He reached out, brushed the surface clean with his gloved thumb, and froze. It was a picture of two men in uniform standing shoulder to shoulder beneath a sun-bleached flag. Younger faces rough with sand and wind. The soldier on the left was unmistakable. Ethan, 20 years younger, the same eyes, though less burdened. And beside him, arms slung over his shoulder in comradeship, was Jonas Hale. For a moment, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The sheriff turned, his brow furrowed. You two serve together? Jonas lifted his head. A faint smile tugged at his mouth. Didn't think he'd remember, he said, voice like dry leaves rustling. Ethan looked toward the fire, a slow exhale leaving his chest. We were stationed in Al Anbar, he said quietly. Sandstorm hit our convoy. Lost our bearings. Jonas pulled me out when the truck went under. I owed him my life. Jonas shook his head, weak but insistent. You repaid it last night. Silence again, but this time it was a different kind, not hollow but full, like the pause before dawn finally breaks. The sheriff lowered the photo, nodding once in respect, the gesture of a man who understood that some debts were never meant to be written down. Outside, the wind began to shift. The first light of morning filtered through the clouds, soft and golden, spilling across the snow like the world itself was forgiving something. The cabin no longer looked like a place of struggle, but of shelter. A small dot of warmth in a landscape learning how to breathe again. The sheriff closed his notebook. I'll file the report as disturbance only, he said. Nothing criminal here. Ethan met his eyes. Thank you. Don't thank me, the sheriff replied, heading for the door. Just take care of the folks who still need you. Hunter followed him to the threshold, tail low but calm, then turned back to Ethan as the truck rumbled away down the hill, its engine fading into the quiet. For a long time, no one spoke. Jonas leaned back in his chair, eyes on the photograph. Martha knelt to throw another log on the fire, her hands finally steady. Lily woke from her sleep, rubbing her eyes, asking softly if the storm was gone. Ethan crouched beside her, brushing a stray hair from her face. Not gone, he said, smiling faintly. Just resting. And maybe he meant the weather. Maybe he didn't. The morning light widened, spilling across the faces of the weary, softening wrinkles, erasing shadows, mending things that had broken long ago. The photograph on the mantel caught that light too, the two young soldiers glowing faintly as if time itself was bowing in quiet acknowledgement. Sometimes the past doesn't come back to haunt. Sometimes it returns to finish what mercy began. The snow didn't vanish. It surrendered. Slowly, quietly, as if tired of its own weight. Drifts thinned into rivulets that traced silver threads down the mountain's spine, whispering life back into the sleeping earth. The air lost its knife edge. It turned gentle, touched with the scent of wet soil and pine sap. For the first time in months, the cabin didn't groan under the wind. It breathed. Ethan stood on the porch with a hammer in his hand. The boards beneath his boots were new, their color still pale against the weathered frame of the house. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms tanned and scarred from work and war alike. Each nail he drove seemed to echo less like labor and more like absolution, each thud a promise to the people inside that this place would hold, no matter what the world outside decided to take. Behind him, laughter rang through the open door. Lily's laughter. It was high, pure, the sound of winter finally breaking. Hunter followed her through the yard, tail swinging in rhythm, his fur glinting gold where sunlight struck it. The dog stopped now and then to look back at her, as if ensuring she never wandered too far from joy. Lily twirled once in the mud, her red shoes flashing against the melting snow, the same ones that had once carried her through cold and fear. Martha watched from the window, her thin hands folded in her lap. There were still dark crescents beneath her eyes, but her face had softened. Her voice no longer trembled when she spoke. Grief had not left her, it rarely does, but it had gentled, grown domestic, like an old cat that no longer claws. Jonas, though, was fading. He moved less each day, the cough lingering longer, the pauses between breaths stretching wider. But he insisted on sitting outside, wrapped in Ethan's old army jacket, watching the world thaw. Ethan built the porch steps where Jonas could see them from his chair. It wasn't much, Just a few boards and a handrail, but the old man smiled every time he looked at it. "Didn't think I'd live to see this mountain turn green again," Jonas murmured one afternoon, his voice barely more than the wind. Ethan knelt beside him, tightening a bolt on the railing. "You'll see the first flowers," he said. Jonas smiled faintly. "Maybe from a better view." That night the air was still. The fire burned low, its light painting soft gold across Jonas's face as he lay in bed. Martha held his hand, her thumb tracing slow circles against his skin. Lily slept curled beside Hunter near the hearth, their breathing a shared rhythm of innocence. Ethan sat nearby, silent, the hammer still on the table beside him. A man ready for work even in the face of endings. Jonas stirred once more, his voice fragile but clear. "You gave us back a home." Ethan leaned forward, but the words had already settled into stillness. There was no struggle, no fear. Just peace, quiet and complete, like snow finally giving way to spring. The burial took place under a sky of pewter and pearl. The ground was soft, not from rain but from forgiveness. The wind carried the scent of pine needles, and birds returned to the branches as if to stand witness. Martha wept silently. Lily held her hand until the last clump of earth fell. Then she stepped forward, small and solemn, and placed her red shoes beside the mound. They looked impossibly bright against the brown soil, an offering, a farewell, a thank you too large for words. Ethan didn't move for a long while. He watched the color fade under shadow, thinking about all the storms he had survived, and the ones still waiting in the corners of memory. When the others went inside, he stayed behind with Hunter, his hand resting on the dog's back, eyes on the mountains turning gold under the late sun. The next morning the world was soft with dew. Birds trilled like laughter reborn. When Ethan stepped outside, he found something tucked under the wiper of his truck, a folded piece of paper, edges damp, ink smudged but legible. The handwriting was shaky but feminine. He opened it. "We're sorry. Maybe someday we can start over too." No name, but he didn't need one. He folded the letter carefully, placed it in the pocket of his jacket, and looked out toward the road that wound down through the valley. It was empty, washed clean by meltwater and time. The world didn't change overnight. The grief didn't vanish, the pain didn't rewrite itself into something pretty. But something in Ethan shifted, small and profound. He had gone into the storm expecting only to survive it, and had instead found something worth living for. That evening, light spilled through the trees in ribbons, warm and gold. Lily ran through the grass barefoot, her laughter mingling with birdsong. Hunter trotted behind her, tail swaying, his bark echoing like joy. Inside, Martha hummed softly as she folded laundry by the open window. And on the porch, Ethan sat alone for a moment, watching the horizon blush under the setting sun. The piano began. Slow, tender, a melody that sounded like memory forgiving itself. The narrator's voice carried through the notes, low and sure, as if spoken by the wind itself. Some people think miracles come in thunder, but sometimes they come quietly, as a stranger who refuses to drive past the broken. The camera would fade there, Hunter lying at Ethan's feet, his eyes half closed in peace. Lily laughing beneath the branches heavy with new leaves, the cabin glowing from within, its windows breathing light. The storm was gone, but the kindness it left behind would stay. There are stories that never make the headlines, quiet ones built not on glory but on grace. Stories like this, where a man doesn't seek redemption, yet somehow finds it waiting at the end of a dirt road. Where a child's laughter can heal what war and winter once broke. In the stillness after the storm, you start to realize courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the hand that stays when everyone else has gone. Loyalty isn't a medal, it's a heartbeat beside yours when the night feels endless. and kindness. It doesn't ask to be seen. It simply endures. Maybe that's what keeps the world standing. Not the heroes who shout, but the ones who stay silent, who rebuild, who forgive. So when you think of miracles, don't look to the sky. Look to the small porch light still burning after the storm. Look to the stranger who stops when others drive by. Because somewhere out there, another heart is healing. This was one of many untold journeys from hearts that heal, where the stories of veterans, their courage, and their quiet acts of love still echo long after the world stops listening.